For years, the northwestern region of Nigeria had been simmering in a state of fear and unrest. The once peaceful villages that dotted the landscape had become battlegrounds for a brutal clash between local communities and extremist forces. Groups affiliated with the Islamic State, operating under different banners and names, had gained a foothold in the region, exploiting the region's vast, rugged terrain to launch their attacks. These extremist factions, determined to spread their violent ideologies, had found fertile ground in the instability that had plagued Nigeria for years. At first, the violence seemed isolated. A few attacks here and there, sporadic acts of terror that disrupted the lives of local farmers, traders, and families. But as the months and years wore on, the attacks became more frequent, more violent, and more widespread. Entire villages were wiped out in a matter of hours, their inhabitants either slaughtered or abducted by groups that seemed to be everywhere at once. Schools, hospitals, and even places of worship were not spared from the violence. The brutality escalated, and it wasn't just limited to physical violence. Whole communities were paralyzed by fear, their daily lives uprooted by constant threats of attack, kidnapping, and murder. Reports of killings, kidnappings, and widespread terror spread like wildfire across the country. The international community began to take notice, but the true scale of the crisis was often overshadowed by the bigger picture of Nigeria's ongoing battle with insurgents in the northeast, including the infamous Boko Haram. Yet, the violence in the northwest was just as deadly, and it was only a matter of time before the world recognized this escalating threat. People in the affected areas no longer felt safe within their own homes. Children stopped going to school, and families barricaded themselves in their houses, never knowing when the next raid would come. As the violence grew more intense, Nigerian officials found themselves overwhelmed, struggling to contain the escalating threat. The local military, stretched thin and underfunded, was unable to keep up with the increasing sophistication of the attacks. The insurgents were well organized, operating with military precision, using modern weaponry and tactics to strike hard and fast. The local forces were simply no match for them. This was a battle of resources and strategy, and the militants had the upper hand. In response, U.S. officials began to take a more active interest in the situation. The U.S. had long been providing Nigeria with intelligence, surveillance, and logistical support in its battle against terrorism. But what had once been routine cooperation was now starting to feel like an urgent need for intervention. The U.S. recognized the growing threat posed by these ISIS-linked groups, not just to the local communities, but to the broader stability of the region. If left unchecked, the situation in northwest Nigeria could spiral out of control, creating a safe haven for terrorists and threatening not just Nigeria, but surrounding countries as well. The two nations, already working together on counterterrorism efforts in other regions, began intensifying their collaboration. Intelligence exchanges became more frequent, with U.S. officials and Nigerian authorities mapping out the movement of extremist cells, tracking their leaders, and pinpointing their strongholds. For the first time, both nations recognized that a larger strategy would be needed to tackle the growing problem. And what started as a routine exchange of intelligence and support quickly became something much bigger. As the situation continued to deteriorate, military officials on both sides began preparing for the inevitable, an escalation in action that would demand more than just intelligence and surveillance. The time was fast approaching when military action would be necessary. Little did the public know, this mounting threat in northwest Nigeria was about to lead to a major international military operation, one that would not only shape the security landscape of the region, but would also drastically alter the relationship between the U.S. and Nigeria. Stay with us as we explore how the tension in northwest Nigeria led to a dramatic military response and how this operation would change everything. As the violence in northwest Nigeria continued to escalate, political pressure from the United States mounted. The situation was quickly turning into one of the most pressing foreign policy issues for the U.S. government, especially as extremist groups linked to ISIS grew bolder in their attacks. With each passing day, the violence seemed to spread further, and reports of atrocities against civilians, including kidnappings and mass executions, filled international news outlets. It was no longer just a regional issue. It was becoming a global one. U.S. leaders, particularly in Washington, were alarmed by the growing instability in the region. They were especially concerned about the rise of extremist groups that appear to be targeting religious minorities, particularly Christians, in the northern regions of Nigeria. This narrative of religious persecution quickly gained traction, both in the media and in the halls of government. The U.S. president issued several stern warnings, publicly condemning the violence and suggesting that the U.S. government would not stand by while extremist groups ravaged entire communities. In late 2025, the rhetoric grew even sharper. President Trump, in a series of public statements, made it clear that if the violence continued unchecked, the U.S. would consider all options, including military intervention. The language was direct. If Nigeria's government could not or would not contain the violence, the U.S. would step in. This marked a critical turning point in the U.S.-Nigeria relationship. What had started as a diplomatic discussion about military assistance soon became a potential military confrontation. The stakes were rising. As the warnings escalated, the debate around foreign intervention began to heat up. Diplomats, analysts, and military officials in both Washington and Abuja were engaged in heated discussions about the sovereignty of Nigeria and whether the U.S. had the right to involve itself in the country's internal security issues. For the Nigerian government, the situation was complex. On the one hand, they knew that they needed help to tackle the extremist threat, but on the other hand, they were fiercely protective of their independence. They had dealt with their fair share of conflict in the past, and foreign intervention was a sensitive subject. Nigerian officials quickly pushed back against the growing narrative that the violence was exclusively a religious issue. While extremist groups had certainly targeted Christian communities, the Nigerian government emphasized that these attacks were affecting people of all faiths, including Muslims. The violence was not solely a clash between religious groups. It was a battle between extremists and ordinary Nigerians who simply wanted to live in peace. The government's message was clear. This conflict was multifaceted, and reducing it to a religious war would only serve to escalate tensions and exacerbate the crisis. Despite these clarifications, the rhetoric from Washington only intensified. U.S. officials, especially in the White House and State Department, began framing the situation as a moral issue, and with each passing day, the pressure on Nigeria mounted. Reports of ISIS-linked militants targeting villages that were predominantly Christian gained more attention, and the growing narrative of religious persecution seemed to push the U.S. closer to military action. Within Nigeria, this political pressure was felt keenly. President Muhammadu Buhari and his administration were caught in a difficult position. On one hand, they needed the support of the U.S. to combat the growing terrorist threat, especially given the limitations of Nigeria's own military resources. On the other hand, they were also wary of what might happen if they were forced into accepting foreign intervention. There was an undeniable concern that U.S. military action could infringe upon Nigeria's sovereignty and create a precedent that would be difficult to reverse. In private discussions, Nigerian leaders stressed that their country was fully capable of handling its own security challenges. But they also acknowledged that the scale of the insurgency had far exceeded anything Nigeria's forces could handle alone. With the U.S. president's warnings growing more frequent and more direct, the Nigerian government had to prepare for the possibility that military intervention might be inevitable. As tensions grew, the situation reached a boiling point. What had once been a series of diplomatic discussions and intelligence-sharing efforts now appeared to be on the verge of military action. The U.S. was ready to follow through on its threat, and Nigerian officials were under immense pressure to respond. The warnings from Washington were no longer just a backdrop. They were shaping the decisions and actions of both governments. The rhetoric had escalated to the point where both sides knew that something had to give. It was clear that military action was not just a possibility. It was becoming an inevitability. The stage was set, and the world watched as the U.S. and Nigeria stood on the precipice of a decision that would forever change the course of their relationship and the security dynamics of West Africa. Stay tuned as we explore how this intense political pressure led to a dramatic escalation in military action. What followed would shape the future of U.S. Nigeria relations and the fight against extremism in Africa. As the political tensions between the U.S. and Nigeria escalated, military planners on both sides knew that time was running out. By late November 2025, the situation in northwest Nigeria had reached a boiling point, and a decision had to be made. The U.S. military, particularly U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, had been closely monitoring the developments for months. Now, it was time to take action. The first step was surveillance. In the weeks leading up to the strike, AFRICOM began conducting surveillance flights over northern Nigeria, particularly the areas where extremist activity had been reported. These flights were not just routine missions. They were carefully planned reconnaissance efforts designed to gather real-time intelligence on extremist movements, militant camps, and potential strike targets. The U.S. military had the advantage of advanced technology and satellite capabilities, which allowed them to track the movements of militants across vast, remote regions. The intelligence gathered from these flights painted a clear picture. Analysts quickly identified key patterns of movement, communications, and supply lines that linked ISIS affiliates operating in northwest Nigeria. These militants had established well-entrenched strongholds in the region, using remote, difficult-to-reach areas as staging grounds for their attacks on civilian populations. It became evident that these extremists were operating with a high degree of organization and coordination, making them a serious threat to local communities and to the stability of the region. As the weeks progressed, the intelligence gathered from these flights was pieced together into a comprehensive picture of the enemy's movements. Analysts at AFRICOM and the U.S. intelligence community were able to pinpoint several key locations that were believed to be used as ISIS staging grounds. These camps were believed to house large numbers of militants, as well as weapons, ammunition, and other resources needed for their attacks. The U.S. had gathered enough evidence to believe that these camps posed an immediate threat, not just to Nigeria, but to the broader region. But the challenge wasn't just gathering intelligence. It was about making sure that any potential strike would be targeted and precise. The U.S. military understood that airstrikes, while effective, also carried the risk of collateral damage. Civilian casualties were something that military planners wanted to avoid at all costs. This was one of the most delicate aspects of the operation. The U.S. wanted to strike decisively, weakening ISIS's operational capabilities, but they also had to ensure that innocent lives would not be lost in the process. This meant working closely with Nigerian security officials. Throughout December, military planners from both the U.S. and Nigeria collaborated quietly and meticulously to vet potential targets. There were constant discussions, data exchanges, and strategic assessments to ensure that the operation would be as effective as possible while minimizing the risk of harm to civilians. U.S. and Nigerian forces were also focused on ensuring the sovereignty of Nigeria was respected, with the Nigerian government having the final say in many aspects of the planning. By early December, after weeks of deliberation, the final targets were selected. Military planners agreed that the airstrikes would take place on Christmas Day, when a large portion of the target sites would be vulnerable due to known movements of ISIS militants. The decision was made, an airstrike would go forward. The timing was deliberate, as it would coincide with a period of heightened vulnerability for the extremists. As the day of the strike approached, the stakes were clear. This wasn't just about disrupting ISIS's operations in northwest Nigeria. It was a test of international resolve. The U.S. had committed to a military action in Nigeria, and the operation would have far-reaching consequences. It would be a turning point in the fight against ISIS in West Africa and would shape the relationship between the U.S. and Nigeria for years to come. For those involved in the planning process, there was no room for error. The risks were high, but the potential rewards were even greater. The operation could weaken ISIS's foothold in Nigeria, disrupt their supply lines, and provide a much-needed boost to Nigeria's ongoing battle against extremist forces. But as the hours ticked down to Christmas Day, one question lingered in the minds of the planners. Would this strike finally tip the scales in the fight against extremism in Nigeria, or would it be just another chapter in a long, bloody conflict? Stay tuned as we explore what happened on Christmas Day and how this high-stakes military operation unfolded. On the morning of December 25th, 2025, as much of the world celebrated Christmas, a different kind of mission was unfolding in the skies over northwest Nigeria. Under orders from the U.S. Commander-in-Chief, American forces launched a series of targeted airstrikes against ISIS positions in Sokoto State, one of the epicenters of extremist activity in the region. The operation had been months in the making, and the timing was critical. The U.S. military, having spent weeks gathering intelligence and coordinating with Nigerian officials, knew that this strike would be a defining moment in the fight against ISIS in Nigeria. The mission was far from routine. These were precision airstrikes, carried out with highly sophisticated munitions designed to hit the targets with maximum efficiency and minimal collateral damage. The targets were well known to U.S. and Nigerian intelligence. Weeks of surveillance, reconnaissance flights, and data sharing had allowed military planners to pinpoint several extremist camps in the remote, rugged areas of Sokoto. These camps, which housed ISIS fighters, were crucial nodes in the terror network responsible for sowing chaos across northwest Nigeria. The goal was clear: to degrade the operational capabilities of these groups and disrupt their ability to plan and execute further attacks. As the strikes began, U.S. officials described the mission as powerful and deadly. The American military was making a clear statement. The U.S. would not stand idly by while extremist groups continued to terrorize local communities. The airstrikes were specifically aimed at ISIS militants responsible for attacks on villages, ambushes on security forces, and the widespread violence that had ravaged the region. The mission was a direct response to the growing crisis in northwest Nigeria, and the U.S. sought to hit the heart of the ISIS infrastructure in the area. U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, quickly confirmed that the strikes had been carried out in coordination with Nigerian authorities. This was a crucial point. While the U.S. military had taken the lead on the operation, it had worked closely with Nigerian officials to ensure that the action was both effective and respectful of Nigeria's sovereignty. The goal wasn't just to strike ISIS militants. It was to protect innocent lives and disrupt the infrastructure that allowed these extremists to operate with such impunity. The airstrikes themselves were swift and devastating. Precision-guided munitions slammed into the extremist camps, resulting in massive explosions and a heavy loss of life among ISIS fighters. For those who had been tracking the movements of ISIS militants, it was a clear and decisive blow to the organization's operations in northwest Nigeria. But while the strikes were successful in taking out a significant portion of ISIS's fighting force in the area, the full scope of the impact remained unclear in the immediate aftermath. U.S. military officials, while acknowledging the success of the operation, kept the exact details of the mission closely guarded. The initial assessments indicated that multiple militants had been killed during the strikes, but the full toll would only be known once the intelligence was fully processed. For the communities in northwest Nigeria, the airstrikes were seen as a moment of relief. The constant threat of ISIS attacks had left civilians living in constant fear, unsure when the next ambush would come or when the next village would be burned to the ground. As reports of the airstrike spread, there was a sense that for the first time in a long while, the extremists might be on the back foot. The U.S. military had shown that it was willing to take action, and in a very real sense, it was standing alongside Nigeria in its fight against terrorism. But while the strikes were a major victory, they were only the beginning of a much larger campaign. The mission had disrupted ISIS's operations in the region, but the extremist threat was far from over. ISIS militants, though struck a heavy blow, were adaptable and resilient. The question remained, would this action be enough to push the extremists into retreat, or would they regroup and return with even greater force? In the days and weeks that followed, the U.S. military continued to monitor the situation closely. More intelligence would need to be gathered, and additional strikes could follow if necessary. But for now, the operation on Christmas Day was a clear statement. The U.S. was willing to intervene when the stakes were high, and it had demonstrated its capability to strike swiftly and effectively. The balance between intervention and respecting national sovereignty would remain a delicate one. But this strike had marked a significant chapter in the ongoing battle against ISIS in Nigeria. Stay with us as we continue to unravel the aftermath of this bold military action and its implications for the future of the fight against extremism in West Africa. In the immediate aftermath of the Christmas Day airstrikes in northwest Nigeria, the international community watched closely as both Washington and Abuja offered their interpretations of the operation. While both sides acknowledged the success of the mission, the framing of the airstrikes and the political rhetoric surrounding them quickly took on a more contentious tone, sparking a debate that would echo in diplomatic corridors for weeks to come. From Washington, the U.S. political leadership was quick to describe the strikes as not just a military success, but as a moral imperative. U.S. officials, including President Trump, framed the operation as a necessary response to the escalating violence carried out by ISIS-linked extremists in northwest Nigeria. They specifically highlighted the violence against Christian communities, pointing to reports of targeted killings, abductions, and destruction of homes. For U.S. leaders, this operation was more than just about defeating a terrorist group. It was a warning to other extremist factions around the world. The strikes were a clear message. International intervention would not be ignored in the face of rising extremism. U.S. officials emphasized that the mission was a demonstration of the U.S.'s commitment to global security and its role in addressing threats that could spill beyond national borders. In a series of statements, U.S. leaders also reiterated that the airstrikes were carried out in close coordination with Nigeria, stressing the cooperative nature of the mission. The U.S. wanted to project a narrative of partnership and collaboration, framing the action as a joint effort to combat terrorism in a region deeply affected by violence. For Washington, the airstrikes were a necessary intervention, an act of self-defense for both Nigeria and the international community at large. The operation was presented as part of the ongoing global fight against extremism, and a signal that the U.S. would not hesitate to act when called upon. However, the narrative coming out of Abuja, the Nigerian government's perspective, was notably different. While Nigerian officials did acknowledge the cooperation with the U.S. in the fight against terrorism, they also took great care to clarify that Nigeria's security challenges were far more complex than a simple case of religiously motivated violence. Officials were quick to point out that the extremist threat in Nigeria was not confined to any one religious group, and that attacks on both Muslim and Christian communities had been ongoing for years. The violence was not limited to religious persecution, but was deeply rooted in political, social, and economic issues that had created fertile ground for extremist ideologies. Nigeria's response also emphasized its sovereignty. While the Nigerian government welcomed foreign assistance, it made it clear that any foreign intervention must be done with respect for Nigeria's sovereignty. The Nigerian government stated that it appreciated the support, but wanted to ensure that any military actions carried out on its soil would not undermine its independence or autonomy. President Buhari and other high-ranking officials stressed that Nigeria had the capacity to handle its own security concerns and would continue to work with international partners in a way that respected its role as a sovereign nation. Nigerian diplomats carefully framed the airstrikes as part of a broader strategy to unite the country in the fight against terrorism, making it clear that the security challenges facing Nigeria were multifaceted and required more than just military strikes to address. This clash of narratives between the U.S. and Nigeria sparked intense international discussion about the role of foreign military intervention in complex, ongoing conflicts. While the U.S. and other international actors viewed the airstrikes as a necessary response to a growing terrorist threat, Nigerian officials warned that external intervention might not provide long-term solutions to the root causes of extremism in the region. Questions were raised about whether military strikes could truly bring about lasting peace in a country that had been struggling with internal divisions and a long history of political and economic instability. The international debate continued, with analysts and diplomats examining the long-term implications of the airstrikes. Would this be a turning point in the fight against extremism in Nigeria? Or would it lead to further tensions between the U.S. and Nigeria? Could the airstrikes pave the way for more targeted operations, or would they deepen the divide between foreign intervention and Nigerian self-determination? As the weeks passed, it became clear that the path forward would not be easy. The road to peace in northwest Nigeria would require much more than military action. It would require political reform, economic development, and a deeper commitment to national unity, something that no airstrike could achieve on its own. Despite the division in narratives, one thing remained clear. The stakes were high. The situation in Nigeria was complex, and the need for long-term solutions was urgent. The airstrikes had disrupted ISIS's operations in northwest Nigeria, but they were not the end of the story. The question now was how both nations and the international community would navigate the challenges ahead. Would Nigeria rise to the occasion and unite in its fight against extremism? Or would the tensions between national sovereignty and foreign intervention continue to complicate efforts for peace? Stay tuned as we explore the long-term consequences of a U.S. intervention and what comes next for Nigeria, its people, and its place on the global stage. The Christmas Day airstrikes on December 25, 2025, were a watershed moment in the ongoing battle against extremism in northwest Nigeria, marking one of the most significant U.S. military actions on Nigerian soil in recent years. This operation was not just a tactical strike aimed at disrupting ISIS's operations in the region. It was a symbol of the shifting dynamics in global counterterrorism strategy, foreign policy, and regional security efforts. The airstrikes represented a turning point, a recognition that extremist groups in West Africa had grown far more dangerous and entrenched, requiring a more direct and coordinated response from international forces. On one hand, the operation was a success. The strikes disrupted ISIS's operations in northwest Nigeria, taking out key militants and infrastructure that had been used to stage attacks and terrorize local communities. In the short term, the mission accomplished its objective. It delivered a powerful blow to a terrorist organization that had long been a scourge on the region. For the U.S. and its allies, it was a demonstration of military might, a reminder that extremist groups could not operate with impunity, and a reaffirmation of America's commitment to global security. But while the airstrikes had immediate tactical success, they also brought long-term questions to the forefront. Despite the disruption caused by the airstrikes, the broader conflict in West Africa remained far from resolved. Extremist groups like ISIS in northwest Nigeria, as well as Boko Haram and other insurgent factions in the region, were adaptive and resilient. These groups had thrived in environments where economic hardship, weak governance, and porous borders allowed them to operate with relative freedom. The impact of the airstrikes, while significant, would likely be temporary unless these underlying issues were addressed. Analysts quickly pointed out the limitations of military strikes alone in combating extremism. While taking out militants and destroying infrastructure was important, it did nothing to address the root causes of terrorism. In regions like northwest Nigeria, where poverty, displacement, and political instability were rife, extremist groups could continue to recruit and radicalize individuals, filling the power vacuum left by ineffective governance. As long as the region remained vulnerable to such factors, military victories would likely be short-lived, and extremist factions would adapt, finding new ways to operate. In the wake of the airstrikes, U.S. officials emphasized that military action was only one part of the broader strategy to defeat terrorism, and the U.S. signaled that it would continue its cooperation with Nigeria and other African partners, focusing on intelligence sharing, joint military operations, and a continued commitment to combating violent extremism across the continent. The U.S. recognized that defeating ISIS and similar groups required a more holistic approach, one that involved humanitarian aid, economic development, and strengthening local governance to prevent the conditions that allowed extremism to flourish in the first place. For Nigeria, the pressure was mounting. The airstrikes had been a clear demonstration of a U.S. commitment to its security, but it was up to the Nigerian government to translate military gains into lasting security improvements for its citizens. The Nigerian government would need to not only continue to work with international partners, but also invest heavily in addressing the root causes of extremism within its borders. Political stability, economic development, and social cohesion would be essential to ensure that the population did not remain vulnerable to extremist recruitment. In the weeks following the strikes, both governments faced significant pressure from the international community. For the U.S., the challenge was balancing its role in counterterrorism with respect for sovereignty and ensuring that the region did not become another perpetual battleground. For Nigeria, the challenge was translating the tactical success of the airstrikes into a long-term, sustainable peace for its citizens. Both nations knew that this was not just a military challenge. It was a political and economic one that would require sustained effort and collaboration. The international discussion that followed the airstrikes also brought to light the wider implications for regional stability. The U.S. and its allies had made clear their commitment to fighting extremism in Africa, but the situation was far from simple. Countries across the region, such as Mali, Chad, and Burkina Faso, had also struggled with growing insurgencies, and many had looked to international partners for assistance. The fight against extremism in West Africa was not just about Nigeria. It was about the broader struggle to ensure security and stability across the Sahel and the greater region. As the airstrikes in northwest Nigeria marked a significant chapter in the ongoing struggle against ISIS, they also highlighted the enduring challenges of long-term conflict resolution in the region. The success of military operations was undeniable, but without lasting political and social reforms, the region's challenges would persist. Both the U.S. and Nigeria would need to continue their efforts, not just to strike at the heart of extremist organizations, but also to build a future where communities could live free from the constant threat of violence and fear. Stay with us as we explore what comes next in the ongoing fight against extremism in Nigeria, and the challenges both nations will face in securing a lasting peace for the region. The world watched closely as the Christmas Day airstrikes struck a significant blow to ISIS's foothold in northwest Nigeria. For many, the operation was seen as a success, a powerful demonstration of international commitment to combating extremism and terror. In the immediate aftermath, the airstrikes were hailed as a decisive moment, weakening one of the most dangerous insurgent groups operating in the region. However, while the operation disrupted ISIS's activities in the short term, it became clear that the broader struggle was far from over. The airstrikes may have dealt a substantial blow, but it was only one step in a much longer and more complex battle. Extremist groups, especially those linked to ISIS, are not easily defeated through force alone. The long-term solution to the violence in northwest Nigeria lies not in military might, but in a comprehensive strategy that addresses the root causes of extremism. These groups thrive in areas where poverty, political instability, and social marginalization persist, and no airstrike or military operation can fully eradicate these issues. While the military action disrupted ISIS's operations in the region, the underlying conditions that fuel extremism remain largely unaddressed. Looking ahead, continued cooperation between Nigeria and its international partners will be crucial. The U.S. and other Western nations have shown a willingness to assist Nigeria in its fight against extremism, but the path to stability requires more than just foreign intervention. Nigeria's own government will need to step up and take leadership, ensuring that the military successes translate into real, lasting changes on the ground. Economic development, political reform, and social integration will be essential to weaken the grip of extremist groups. Without these changes, extremist organizations can and will continue to exploit the vulnerabilities of local communities. Security analysts are keenly watching how the insurgent groups will respond to the disruption caused by the airstrikes. Militant organizations have proven time and again that they are adaptive and capable of reorganizing in the face of military pressure. Even with significant losses, ISIS's network in Nigeria is far from dismantled. These groups will likely shift tactics, move to new areas, or attempt to regenerate their forces. The ability of Nigerian forces, alongside international partners, to anticipate these changes and stay one step ahead will be a key factor in determining the future of the fight against extremism in the region. Alongside the military pressure, the diplomatic and political solutions will need to evolve. The international community will have to remain committed to supporting Nigeria in ways that go beyond the battlefield. Humanitarian aid, economic assistance, and support for good governance will be critical in the long term. As military action has demonstrated, ISIS and other extremist groups thrive in environments where poverty, disenfranchisement, and weak governance exist. Tackling these underlying issues will require a sustained commitment to peace-building, development, and human rights. For the people of northwest Nigeria, the airstrikes offered a moment of relief. For the first time in years, the violence had been temporarily halted, and the extremists responsible for so much suffering had been targeted. The fear that had gripped local communities, where each day was marked by the uncertainty of when the next attack would come, had momentarily lifted. But this moment of reprieve was just that, temporary. The larger struggle for lasting peace and security in northwest Nigeria is far from over. The people of northwest Nigeria have endured unimaginable hardships. Thousands have been displaced, communities have been torn apart, and livelihoods have been destroyed. The stakes are high, not just for the Nigerian government and its international partners, but for the innocent civilians who are caught in the crossfire. These communities are looking for more than just military strikes. They're searching for hope, for a future where they can rebuild, where they can live without fear of attack, and where their children can grow up in safety. As the world moves forward, the real question is not whether military action can bring an end to the violence, but whether a comprehensive strategy can emerge that addresses the root causes of extremism. It's about more than just taking out militant leaders or destroying camps. It's about providing the people of northwest Nigeria with the opportunities and protection they need to rebuild their lives. This requires not just military victories, but a long-term, multifaceted effort to stabilize the region politically, socially, and economically. Stay tuned as we continue to explore the path forward, the challenges ahead, and how both Nigeria and its international partners must work together to create a future free from extremism and violence.